By 2025, in just 6 years, for every 100 middle-aged individuals in the United States, there will be 253 seniors. Being prepared is key to making sure the senior years are safe, happy, and comfortable. Tonight, with our esteemed panel of speakers, we hope to provide you with some tools to help you and your loved ones age with dignity.
Many of us of any adult age really aren't enthusiastic about entering into that conversation. And of course, the issue is that none of us necessarily want to acknowledge that life on this planet is time limited. And so it's not easy to think about not being around and that at some point we all will pass. But what I'll say to get us started is that these are really important conversations to have. And I, as a geriatric psychiatrist at UCSD, almost daily witness the horrible stress and trauma that occurs when planning hasn't taken place. And it really puts everyone, the person, the loved ones of that person, into very awkward and difficult situations. And so I hope that I can say a few things tonight that will inspire you to overcome whatever hesitation that you may have and be able to bring up this in conversation. Because truly, my bias is that the sooner the better. And I think everyone in this room, frankly, should have already in place some really important documents that will help them and their loved ones going forward. Because the truth is, none of us really know when we may pass. And so it's really important that we are as prepared as we can be. So how do you introduce the topic? Well, the very first thing I'll say is, I don't care how you bring it up, but bring it up. That's the very first thing. And I think what I've discovered is that there are kind of three different types of people. There are people that you'll bring it up, and they'll be fine, and they'll be grateful, and they'll really go with it. And then there are people that no matter how many times and no matter how clever you are, you'll bring this up and the door will just get slammed in your face. And then there's an intermediate group. There's a group that won't necessarily want to speak about it, but if you spend some time with them, I think eventually you may help turn things around and loosen them up a little bit, and they will be comfortable. So those are the ones that I'm going to focus on, that middle group, because the group that slams the door in your face repeatedly, it's just never going to happen. And that's painful but real. And of course, the group that's all in right up front, you're done. But it's that middle group that I think we can focus on. And so there are a couple of things I want to mention about how you might bring this up in conversation, planning for the last phase of life. And I think one thing that works well is to actually begin by telling that person that your goal is just to listen to what their priorities are and make sure that those priorities are followed. And what you really want to do is just make sure that their wishes are filled. And so if you frame it as, my job is just to help you make sure that things turn out the way you want them to, a lot of times that really is all that that person needs to hear. Sometimes not. And if I bump into a lot of hesitation or resistance, then I switch into my psychiatrist mode. But I actually think you guys can do this even without a background in psychiatry, because what we know now that happens when people are hesitant to speak about end-of-life planning is it's obviously their emotions are blocking the process. And so the only way to move forward is to begin to help them identify the feelings that they have and speak about those feelings with the hope that if they can speak about their feelings enough, then those feelings will be resolved, and then they won't be blocking the process of discussion. So 2 key things. Emphasize that the goal is to be helpful and to make sure that that person's wishes are executed when the time comes, that their wishes are fulfilled. And then if you're getting resistance, be patient and just try to get them to speak about why they're uncomfortable. What is their fear? What is it that makes the conversation difficult and a conversation that they'd rather avoid?
The first thing is to have these conversations. Determine who your power of attorney is, who your decision maker is, and find the right person. So many of us choose our spouse, or we choose our child, or all of our children because we feel a familial obligation to them. But in reality, you should be choosing someone who is not going to die before you, or not going to have dementia when you're needing someone to make decisions, or you need to choose someone who is going to really follow what it is that you want to see happen in your end of life. And even though we all love our kids, sometimes our kids, especially putting all of them with equal power, just creates conflict. So it's important to select the right person. The second thing is to talk to that person and all of your family and really let them know what it is you want to see happen as you age. I call this your quality of life statement. And it is really kind of getting into the details, getting into the weeds of what is important to you. And everybody is different. Some people want all their family around them. Other people want to be alone. Some people, cleanliness is the most important. Other people, it's listening to music. Whatever it is, you need to detail that out. And I always suggest memorializing it in some form. So it's not just the legal paperwork. It's making it a personal statement. So that when that person who is carrying out those wishes for you hears what is on that list of to-dos, what I want, they actually can hear it coming from your voice. Or when they're challenged by your difficult son or daughter, I don't want that to happen to mom. I want you to do the feeding tube. They can show them the document that says, I don't want heroic treatment. And it's in your words or a video, whatever it is. And that person can actually hear you saying it, right? So when it comes from your voice, it makes a huge difference versus coming from a legal document. The conversations are hard, but you must have them. That is the only way to really have your wishes fulfilled. And then the third thing I'll say is have a team. You don't have to do this by yourself. Create a partnership with a professional, someone who is, many of us on this panel actually are used to doing these things. So you can start with your attorney, you can start with your financial planner, you can start with a aging life care manager, psychologist, whoever it is, to start to ask these questions and help to get this guidance. You don't have to do it alone. So find a team, find someone to work with on this.
The most important documents you want to have are, while you're alive, is basically a power of attorney, a financial power of attorney. The second document I would say is make sure that you have a trust and the will. You also want to make sure that you have an advanced healthcare directive and a HIPAA authorization to authorize the release of your medical information to the doctors so that they can, or to your agent so that they can make decisions on your behalf if you needed to. Oftentimes people say, when is the right time to prepare these documents? My answer would be, if you haven't had them already done, yesterday.
Most advisors would probably say start planning around the age of 50 to 60. There's really no perfect magic solution to say this is the perfect age to do it. But knowing the industry, it's had a really big course correction over the last few years, and these insurance policies that were first brought into the market, in the 70s and the 80s, there was 40 to 50 carriers that were selling the insurance. We're down to about 10 carriers that actually offer the product. So that tells you a lot of these carriers are getting out of the business because, quite frankly, they just are getting beat up. So I always tell clients, look, you're one doctor appointment away from not qualifying for the insurance. Okay, I'm 40 years old. I bought my first policy at 35. Some people think I'm crazy, but I've seen these policies and I've seen these carriers really clamp down on qualifying for this insurance. So do I have this extremely robust policy at the age of 40? No, but I just want to preserve as part of my financial plan to have that ability to get the insurance. And so I've secured some insurance for the both of us. It's fairly inexpensive. Okay, so there's no magic age, but definitely before you go to your next doctor appointment, I would encourage you to look at getting some insurance, because you're literally one little thing in that doctor's records could make you decline. There's standalone products that are really just geared towards, there's a couple different variations of them. You can do most commonly they're comprehensive policies. So they'll cover in-home care, nursing homes, skilled nursing, adult daycare centers, and they'll cover a lot of those things. They do have other variations of those that are strictly in-home only, some that are facility only. Those sometimes can be a little less expensive, but again, I like to preserve options. I don't want to necessarily pigeonhole myself into one. So there's that. There's also a big trend that's came onto the industry is hybrid policies. These are typically life insurance policies that have the ability to have accelerated care or long-term care within these policies. So that's a really big emerging trend in the industry right now that's come on really in the last few years.
What I do is I work with older adults and their families to assess what it is that they need and then to create a care plan. So as an aging life care manager, and San Diego's a pretty fortunate community, we have about 25 to 30 aging life care managers in the community. And we have 4 essential roles. It's to assess, to coordinate, to monitor, and to educate. So when we're assessing, we're meeting with a family member. Sometimes it's the older adult and one of the children or a spouse or someone may be there along with them. We're looking at their situation and we're looking at it holistically. We're looking at everything there is about them. It's not just what's happening with them medically, but what's happening with them socially, spiritually. Is there any depression or isolation in this individual's life at this moment? What is it that they would like to do? Who were they in the past? I always joke that just because you turn 65, you don't automatically become identical, right? Everybody has a background, everybody has different goals, and they want to continue to live a certain lifestyle or a certain way. They have certain desires that they want to see happen, so like at their bucket list. So we assess the situation and try to find how do we best provide quality of life for this person as a whole individual, not just as a medical file. And then we coordinate those services. So we work with the families, we work with the individuals to find the right resources to help them. And then we continue to work with them in a monitoring phase where we are actually doing care management. We might be doing some of the tasks with them or for them. We try to do it with them because it's more empowering for the individual if they're doing as much as they can and being as independent as possible. They are always a part of the decision-making process. And we're adjusting as we go because life is fluid. We don't set a plan and it's goes on for the next 5 or 10 years. It might not even go for the next 5 days if that person has a lot of medical issues or social issues or other. And then we serve as advocates and educators. So we are advocating for our client. The older adult is always our primary concern. Someone else might be paying the bill, but it really is about the individual, not about so much the payer. It is about the client and what it is that is what's in that person's best interest. So we're advocating for them, and that could be with family members. That could be with people in their social network. It could be with their physicians. It could be with other providers of services. I mean, I've had discussions with the gardener before about what's appropriate and not appropriate. And then we're educating. We're educating the client about their condition, about their options, about what's out there, the resources, about the legal paperwork or financial issues that they might need to address, about community options like, Bobby's location, all sorts of things that are there, moving options, you name it. So we are working with a network of resources all the time to educate and advocate on behalf of our clients.
The 2 main ways you buy an insurance policy. The other is you just self-insure with your own personal assets, hope that you have enough to cover that, right? And if you don't have enough, then you know, you'll be forced to sell assets or homes or other things. So there's not a lot of options. I did mention the life insurance policy. There's the ability, if you have a permanent or a cash value life insurance policy, you might not have as much of a need for the death benefit anymore. You can actually do what's called a 1035 exchange. As long as you qualify for the long-term care insurance, you can transfer that into a long-term care policy. You might even be able to preserve some of the death benefit, but now I can have that cash value pay for the policy. So if you don't have as much of a need for the death benefit, that is an option. You can always save into a HSA, and you know, it's pretty limited how much you can get into that, but there are some tax benefits to that. You're pretty limited, and you know, some people might qualify for government benefits, but it's pretty tough to.
Tyler, do you want to say what an HSA is, just in case?
Health savings account, sorry, HSA. Health savings account, so you're, I believe the limits in 2019 for a family is about $6,900 that you can put into that account. You get the write-off or the deduction on your income. And that money can roll over year to year, and those dollars can be used, but it's just limiting because, as we know, I mean, the average cost of care in San Diego is about $408 a day. So if I can get $6,900 a year into an HSA, that's not going to get me very far. Okay, but it's a good option, and it's a tax benefit, right?
Are any of the payments tax deductible?
In long-term care.
Yes.
So up to a certain extent, there are some deductions for long-term care based on your age. There's limits of how much you can actually deduct. The sweet spot is C corporations. If you have a business that is a C corporation, you can actually fully deduct the premiums, 100%. And it's still a tax-free benefit coming out. So I don't know anything else on this planet, legally anyway, that is not taxed on either side, you know, so that's a really nice benefit. If you're a C corporation, you can buy a policy, and even if you can kind of somewhat discriminate within the corporation, you don't have to offer it to all employees. You can offer it to just owners, executives, management level, etc. If you want to offer it to all employees, call me. I'm happy to set that up. But C corporations are ideal for that. But the limited, I'm hoping that one day Congress or the IRS will change the tax code on this. They need to encourage more people to buy long-term care insurance to take a little bit of relief off of the government system because it's failing. So I think the only way they'll do that is if they offer us more tax benefits, because right now the deduction is very, very low.
These are often a source of confusion. When we talk about competence, this is actually a legal term, and it usually is applying to a global ability for a person to make reasonable decisions for themselves. And really, a person cannot be declared competent or incompetent unless there's a judicial review process. It requires a legal review, and a judge has to declare whether or not, based on the evidence presented, whether someone is competent or not. Competency is often confused with this term called capacity. It's different. All of our capacities combined add up to whether or not we are competent. But capacity is decision and situation specific, and it really rests upon a person's ability to understand a particular decision and its ramifications. And so as a psychiatrist, I'm often asked to determine if someone has mental or cognitive capacity. And so those terms are interchangeable. But what we're talking about is whether or not a person has enough intellectual function that they can tell me what the decision is, what it will mean if they make that decision, what it will mean if they don't make that decision, and they have to really reassure me that they get it and understand it. And so there are different levels of capacity that we have to look at. So it's much different in terms of having the capacity to choose what you want for supper versus the capacity to enter into a complicated legal contract with long-reaching implications. So we can't make global statements about capacity. We have to assess capacity according to each question and situation. And I welcome other input if I didn't quite nail that.
No, I think you did, and it tails into the next part, which I was going to talk about. A lot of clients will come in and see me and say, I think that my mom or my dad no longer has capacity to manage their financial affairs. What do we do? They'll say they have dementia or Alzheimer's, or we're getting concerned with their decision-making ability. And a lot of clients don't understand the difference between, or clients that I should say have estate plans in place, usually will have named their successor trustee, or they've named their agent under their power of attorney. And so they'll say, well, my son or my daughter, they're named in my documents. I said, well, they're named and that's a nomination, but they can't act for you. And the reason why they can't act for you is because one of two things has to happen. Your documents are all usually springing powers of attorney or springing powers, and that's in your trust as well. And the switch doesn't get turned on until you've had a physician, and it's usually two, determine that you lack capacity to manage your own financial affairs or make your own medical decisions. And that is one, difficult because it's sometimes you have a situation where it's physically hard to get the client to the doctor. The other issue that you have is that you're going to go see a doctor who is making a determination and taking away your independence and your control. And we want to age with dignity. And so what I try to advise my clients is that if you find or if you notice that you're having memory issues, or you're not able, it's taking you longer to write a check, or you're not paying your bills as quickly as you normally do, let's have a discussion with your family and bring them in. And what we can do is make your documents effective immediately and put that person in charge. And what I find is a lot of my clients fear the loss of control. And so a way that I will typically say is, you're still the captain. So if you don't like what your co-captain is doing, you can remove them. But maybe let's get a co-captain in here to make sure that if you want to go take a nap, someone's not steering the ship into the rocks, so that you're still in charge.
And Laura, I would add another source of confusion that I bump into quite often in my clinical practice is that you can have dementia and you can still have capacity. So being diagnosed with dementia does not automatically take away your decision making. Again, it would depend on the level of dementia and the complexity of the decision, whether or not you really still have the capacity or not.
And so tailoring on to that, to talk about it again, you have springing powers, which is it requires two physicians to determine that you're incapacitated in order for somebody to act. And then you have a choice where if you come in early enough and you plan for this, we can start to transition. I know that I'm currently serving as a trustee for my grandmother who's 91. She, still is in charge in her mind, but we take care of paying all of her bills. We pay for the caregivers, and she has money when she needs it, but she doesn't have to worry about all the day-to-day stuff that she doesn't like to do.
First of all, I think that the first step is for you to have a conversation with your parent or the person involved and just try to get a sense of where their resistance is coming from. A lot of times it might be based on false information or incorrect information. A lot of times it might be based on trust issues, not legal trust issues, but trust between people issues, and they're just not really certain who they can rely on and who they can trust, and so they're hesitating to do it. So all of this has to be brought to the surface if you can and talked through. And I really try to advise that it happens sometimes in small pieces. It doesn't have to be all at once because sometimes it's so overwhelming to take it all in one conversation. I think it's really smart that you pay really careful attention to the cues that you're getting during the interaction in terms of facial expression and body language, because if you're noticing that this person is really kind of withdrawing and getting a worried expression, it may be time to kind of take a break, or if not, to try to find words to describe the feeling that you think those nonverbal cues are giving you, so that you don't want to bully, you don't want to push. You want to recognize that this is really difficult, and you want to try to just help them work through their hesitation as best you can. Now, I will own, though, that sometimes if it's family members, it may not go as smoothly because a family has a history, right? Surprise, surprise. And so it may be that somehow the family relationships and their history are really the sticking point. And so sometimes if you've tried and you're just not getting anywhere, it might be good to bring in a neutral person who is reputable, that the person will feel more comfortable with and be able to trust. So that's plan B. If you've done your very best to be patient and supportive, and you've broken it into little pieces, and you've identified all the feelings you can possibly identify, and still it's just not going forward in the way it needs to, then I would think about a neutral third party that might be more successful than you have been. Does that help?
That is. Because the alternative, too, is that, which again, I think in terms of planning and having to try to find the right person, is that ultimately, if you can't get someone to, kind of release that control, then you're faced with having to get a conservatorship. And that is very expensive. It's public. It's very intrusive. And I think it's painful for families.
It's very painful for everyone, and it often, unfortunately, can lead to sometimes irreparable damage, irreparable injury in the relationship, because it's just hard to let those painful feelings go.
What I talk to my clients about is the short term and the long term. Short term, perhaps your home is still the right place to be, but maybe long term it's not, or maybe even short term, the stairs are getting harder to navigate, or you don't have, your friends have all moved away, and now you're a little bit more isolated than you were before. So these are some of the things that I have my clients kind of think about, and I'll go through the home with them and really try to understand what their needs and wants are in a home in general, not just that home. Now, I understand a lot of times people have been in their homes for 30, 40 years, and that's a very difficult process or even thought to move away from the home that they raised their children in and to move somewhere else. But I think as the panel has talked about, is what's the best thing for you long term, legally, financially, and then your safety. Is that the right place you should be? So really, it's a good thing to do it earlier rather than later. And again, understand what's best for you now may not necessarily be what's best in the future, and plan early. I heard earlier, and as Dr. Sewell said, an ounce of prevention is way more valuable than a pound of cure.
Well, before you get rid of that microphone, I have a couple more questions for you.
All right, then.
What if I need to sell my home to pay for the cost of care? Can you talk about selling my home and the risk of capital gains taxes? Sometimes people say, well, what if the kids will say, I don't want mom and dad to sell the home because there's a family attachment. We want you to keep it. Sometimes the kids or the family will say, well, you should rent it out. And then this becomes overwhelming for the client. And I wanted to also see if you could talk about like the parent-child exclusion from reassessment as well.
Sure. Okay, so
That's
you
a
get
lot.
all
Wait,
that
wait.
done.
I'll remind you as we
What
go
was the
along.
first thing you said? No.
I'd say the first thing is
Yeah.
in terms, what are if you were to sell your house and pay capital gains tax?
Sure. Okay, so if you've been in your home for a long period of time, you may have capital gains tax. And I'm not an accountant. I have to say this right up front. I'm not an accountant. I can't give tax advice, but there's an exclusion you have for capital gains tax based on if you're single versus if you're married. And if you've been in your home for 30, 40 years and you bought it for $65,000, for example, you're going to probably have some capital gains. If, however, the home remains in your estate and you pass, and then it's then inherited by someone in the family, there's a stepped-up basis, so they're not having to pay capital gains even if they go sell the house. So that's sort of the short answer there. So some people in their estate plan, it's better to hold on to the home. However, I think the first thing you said was if you have to sell the home to pay for care, you need that money. For most people in the United States, the home is their largest asset. Unless you have a $20 or $30 million estate, which is great, but for most people, it's the home. And if you are going to move into another living situation, or you are going to stay home but you need care and you did not plan ahead and get long-term care insurance and you are self-funding, a lot of times it's going to come from the home. And there are a couple different ways you can access that, but it may wind up being that selling your home is the only way to free up the money to be able to pay for that care. So it kind of goes along the lines, and we work with clients all the time where they are selling their home and they're taking that nest egg and they plan well with that home, and now they have the resources to pay for either a senior community that Bobby will talk about, or if it's to move into another smaller space where there's a lot less to deal with and a lot less to manage, and they can have someone come in the home and take care of their daily needs and so forth.
And can you also talk about where the kids may be interested in keeping the home because of the parent-child exclusion from reassessment?
Yeah, so we talked earlier about conflict in families, and unfortunately that comes to play a lot when it comes to the family home. And so to that point, they might want to have the home stay in the family because if mom and dad have to pay capital gains, there's less in the estate for later on down the line. I would hate to think that kids would think like that.
Yeah, right.
However, I have heard many situations where that's the case. I'm sure no one in here has kids who are like that. But it's a reality. It's what happens. So a lot of times kids will want to do that. I've dealt with clients before where there are 3 or 4 siblings. I had one recently where one was the medical power of attorney, another one was the financial power of attorney, and they did not agree on the sale of the home. She thought, oh, mom will definitely be moving back to the home. She was in a long-term care community. She had Alzheimer's. She was not moving back to the house in a different state. And so he made the decision, we have to sell. So that could be a lot of conflict sometimes. This is, again, why you should have those things worked out ahead of time, because she didn't have it worked out as far as when she would sell the home, when was the right thing, and she needed that money for that care. And he made, I think, the right decision. It's not necessarily the right decision for everyone, though. It may be better to hold on to the home, whether it's for the kids or or for whatever. So there's a lot of things that go into it.
Well, and another reason why the kids might be interested in keeping the home is that for a lot of San Diegans, they bought their home in the 60s and 70s and they have low property taxes. How many have low property taxes? I'm jealous. And so you have low property taxes, but you have high fair market value of your house. And so a lot of the kids will look at it and say, well, I can, if mom and dad die, I can inherit their property taxes and keep that same basis in the property. So that's where they may not want to sell the house, because if they were to keep it, they would have, let's say $1,000 or $2,000 on what would be assessed at, $1 million home would be close to $10,000 in property taxes. So I've seen that as motivation as to why kids don't want to sell the house, and even why clients don't want to sell the house, because they want to pass that asset down to their kids, because it is a sentimental asset.
For a lot of folks, what they know about community living is what existed 30 years ago. First of all, it was what they saw on TV, which is rarely flattering. Or it's what our parents and grandparents talked about, which was the home or the nursing home or the convalescent center. And there are so many now, there are so many variations now, and there's so much more to choose from. The world has changed dramatically, and it's done it in favor of those who are looking for community living. And so now a lot of the communities are designed more like resort living, or it's like living on a cruise ship. And when you're in a community setting versus a home setting, you now have access to a lot more dimensions of wellness that we all need so desperately in our lives. So, you've got the social factor, you've got the physical factor, you've got emotional, spiritual, so there's all these different things that we now have available to us in these communities that often we can't get in our own homes. I'm a big fan of home support if that is a viable option for that particular person and that family. But there are going to be things that may not be available in the home. When you come to a community, you're going to have a full team surrounding you 24 hours a day. So you've got someone there at all times. And so when you're in the home, if your caregiver is sick, or if your sister's been coming over to help you and she's not available that day, what's happening that day. Whereas in the community, you've got a full team. And so you've also got folks like maybe a dietitian, you might have a medical director, nurses, a full activities department. So you have all of these folks that are adding to all those dimensions of wellness in addition to the care that they can give you. So, and there are so many different variations in what's available. We have everything from smaller, what's called a board and care home, which would be a home of about 6 people, and that's a great fit for some folks. It may not have all of the attributes that a larger community will have, like a lot of outings and activities and things like that. But for those who like a nice, quiet, small setting, that's a wonderful alternative. And then we have larger communities. Again, it might be like living on a cruise ship, and you want to look at what are the options within that community. Some may have all of the continuum of care levels. So you might have independent living and assisted living and memory care, and some may have skilled nursing on campus as well. So in community living, you have a full team that is not only there to support your care needs, but they're a witness to your life. So when your daughter comes to visit and says, I don't know what's happening with my mom, she doesn't look quite the same as she did when I visited here last time. Well, if you have a full team there, they should be communicating with you and say, hey, we noticed this is happening with your mom, and here's what we're doing, and what's your input on that? Or maybe you have some insight to give. There's a lot of voices that are going to tell the story to help a community to give them the best quality of life. So there's your voice, there's the resident's voice, there's the doctor's voice, the care team's voice. And we want to listen to all of those voices. And all of those voices tell us that story. How do we care for mom the best way we possibly can? One of my favorite stories is I was working in a community, and in the memory care neighborhood, we had a gal that whenever we would go to get her for breakfast, we had to go around a corner. And on that corner was a small living room. And when we would get to the living room, she would stop, she would freeze, and she would do this motion over and over and over. And it was a good 5 to 10 minutes every time, wouldn't move. She was not talking with us verbally. She was communicating. We just didn't understand the language that she was speaking in. So, and then she would stop when she was done, and she would go to eat her breakfast. So we started doing a little digging, and what we learned was that she spent a lot of time on her grandmother's farm growing up. And Grandma said, "You don't eat till those chickens eat." So they would stand and feed the chickens. And so our team joined that journey. And so we had a couple folks that would meet her in the living room, and as soon as we would get down there, the girls would go, "All right, let's go." And we would all feed chickens. And she took on the role of her grandmother and would stand with hands on hips, and then she would, and that was her grandmother's move when everything's done and we can go get breakfast now. So, everyone's going to learn to communicate with us, or we're learning how to communicate with them actually in their language. So, but you have a lot more witnesses to their lives and what's going on with their care. And so that we can communicate with, Dr. Sewell and Dr. Montano and the folks that are involved in their lives. So you've got that full continuum of care surrounding them at all times.
No one wants to part with their stuff. And also they're overwhelmed. Like, how am I going to go from a 4-bedroom home into a 1 or 2 bedroom in a community? And I want to keep everything. So that would be the biggest challenge is stuff.
And how do you help them get rid of this stuff?
So I always like to ask the audience, how many of you have heard of the senior move management industry? Can you raise your hand? See, this is the challenge. This is an emerging industry. People don't know. So I own a company called Silver Linings Transitions. We're a senior move management company. And we help seniors when they are making the decision to move into communities or into smaller spaces, but typically downsizing. And so we actually will create a floor plan with them and help them figure out what they can realistically and safely fit in their homes, because maybe they have wheelchairs or walkers, or maybe they have some medical conditions that are going to lead to some limitations. Can they reach their arms all the way up anymore? Are they going to be entertaining 12 people? Do they need to keep all their china and all their dishes? So it's going through their belongings with them and helping them get a realistic sense of how are you really going to live? And when it comes to belongings, I always say that people hold on to belongings for a couple different reasons. One is aspirational, and think of women in our closets, 4 sizes, because one day we're going to get back into that small size, right? So let's be realistic, okay? One of them is a cost that, especially I see a very big, I can walk into someone's home and I can tell how old they are based on their belongings. I don't have to meet them because we have a generational shift. And, the older generations really like to collect things because, my professional opinion, I'm not a doctor, is when you went without, you want to accumulate so that you feel like, okay, well, if anything ever happens, I can sell the Yadro. And so the other challenge that we have is that everybody in that generation has the Yadros. And then you're dealing with the IKEA generation, and they're like, they don't like it, they throw it away, and what's a Yadro? So we're looking at all of that. And so the biggest challenge that I find is getting people to come to terms with the fact that they can't take everything, and really just, assuring them we can make this happen, we can do this. And it's amazing. A lot of you probably have heard of the Pareto principle, that you really only need 20% of what you have. We did a move-in today for a woman. She has dementia. She was moving into a 2-bedroom into Pacific region. I think she had 3 or 4 sets of china. She had like an espresso, a coffee maker, a juicer, a Vitamix. And the daughter and the mother were just at, and we couldn't find enough space because, some people they're just not ready to hear it.
Along those lines, you had mentioned to me the syndrome, the senior
relocation stress syndrome.
Relocation stress syndrome, and maybe you and Dr. Sewell can talk about this.
I'll talk about what I know, and then because I'm sure he knows a lot more. But okay, so the move into a senior community, from what I've learned in my industry, is that it's often regarded as the most stressful transition a person will make in their lifetime. And I actually go into people's homes when I start the transition with them, and I say, I want to let you know that there are 2 things you need to know. One is your stuff's not worth what you think it is, and I'd rather tell you that now. And the other is you're probably going to be stressed out, and stress causes havoc on our bodies. You don't have to be a doctor to know that. And I actually see a lot of clients who've ended up in the hospital with bladder infections, a lot of memory loss. So what we try to do is first of all, to proactively say, this is going to be stressful. And as much as I tell you, believe me, this isn't going to be stressful, you're still going to get stressed. And also to make that transition as gentle as possible as we can. So that's why companies like mine exist, where we can go in and we can recreate. We'll take pictures of a credenza or a buffet, and then we'll recreate it, and we'll recreate what's on the nightstand, and we'll make the bed with the hospital corners if that's the way they want their bed made. But I think the important thing is addressing it and saying, I know you're scared. I know this is scary. And not to dismiss it, but just like we've all talked about, I'm scared of aging, and I'm only 49, but it's scary. It is. It's scary. So that's relocation stress syndrome.
Let me say to begin with, for those of you who have parents and you're engaged in those types of dialogues, do your very best not to say those words. Try to understand what it is that you really mean when you say those words. And what you really mean is, I love you, I'm going to keep your best interests in mind, I will never abandon you, we're going to walk this journey together. That's what you really mean. You don't necessarily literally mean, I'll never put you in the home, or if you mean it in that moment, you're just responding to some emotions inside of you like guilt that are going to come back to haunt you. Now, if you have said those words, remember, every adult has the right to change his or her mind. And you can say to your parent, I did say that, but you know what? Things were different then. And here's the reality today. And based on these circumstances, I've changed my opinion. Okay, so that's a tricky one, but you have to just deal with it. Now, it is very stressful, and I'll add to what Jamie said. It's not just about stress causing physical illness. Stress can cause psychiatric illness. And a lot of what Jamie is referencing, in my world, we're going to call grief. Because when you move out of a home that you've lived in for 40 or 50 years, that's a huge change, but that's also a huge loss. Now, my favorite person in the realm of bereavement and grief is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Many of you may have heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Wrote a very famous book called On Death and Dying. And in this book, based on her long-term work with people who are in hospice care, she identified different stages of the grief process. And I'm sure Jamie bumps into those all the time, as does Bobby when you're greeting people who are moving into Monarch Cottage. The different stages of grief that were identified by Kubler-Ross include anger, denial, depression, bargaining, and then ultimately we hope people land in a place called acceptance. Now, Kubler-Ross thought that these phases were sequential. I think we've updated her theory a little bit, and we now understand that they may or may not be sequential. People may be in one stage and jump to another and jump back to the previous stage. And eventually, though, we hope that we can get that person to a place where most of the time they're in the place of accepting the situation so that they can make good, smart, rational decisions. How do we help people grieve? Well, it's important because the more successful we are at helping people grieve, the more flexible they will ultimately become, and the more rational their decision-making will become. But grief is really about feeling identification and expression, and doing that in the context of loving, caring relationships where those feelings are heard, validated, and acknowledged. And the more you can do that with someone who's going through this process of loss, the better it will be. Now, specifically, when dealing with someone who has dementia, that's a tricky one. I'm going to share some thoughts with you about how we handle this on the inpatient unit where I work at UC San Diego, because often what happens is that people are brought to our unit in a crisis related to cognitive loss, related to emerging or even long-standing dementia that's flown under the radar. And it's quite clear by the time they land on my inpatient unit that the situation that they were in was completely unacceptable. It was so dangerous. They were just hanging by a thread in terms of their safety and well-being. And so it's quite clear by the time we've completed our assessment, which includes very meticulous cognitive testing, looking at whatever preserved cognitive function they may have and where their deficits may be. But ultimately, we often discover that the cognitive deficits have become so extensive and so severe that returning to their home is just not safe, ethical, or realistic. And so then we have to sit down and we have to have what we call in our unit a family meeting, where we bring together as many of the devoted, loving family members as we can, and we sit down in one room and looking at the person with dementia face to face in a very respectful way. We don't talk about them, we talk directly to them. A big mistake is to talk about that person in the third person. Let me tell you, if you do that, you'll quickly discover you've really made a big mistake, because it's an insult to the person living with dementia to be in the room and have you talking about them as if they weren't there. So we give all of our information directly to the person, knowing that they may be only retaining a small portion of it, but we still want to give them the benefit of the doubt and speak to them directly. And as we speak to them, we just summarize the results of our assessment. We talk about how they're doing from a medical perspective and what that means. We talk about how they may be doing from a psychiatric perspective if they have some psychiatric challenges. And lastly, strategically, we cover their cognitive assessment last. And we do it last because inevitably what we're going to say is going to upset them. And if we started with it and upset them up front, anything else we'll say isn't even going to register. So we save that piece for the end. And we very systematically talk to them about how they did on the tests. We'll even show them visually, here's this test, remember this test. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. So we really try to assume that they can get enough of this that they're going to be able to make a rational decision. But ultimately, what we'll say to them is that what they need, most of all, at this moment in their life, is to be as physically and psychiatrically as healthy as possible, because the healthier they are physically and psychiatrically, the better their brain will function. And we'll say to them, unfortunately, our tests have revealed that your brain is injured, but your brain is going to function at its best if we fine-tune every other aspect of your health. So this is a top priority. Lastly, we say, the brain is like a muscle. If you don't use it, you'll lose it. But what we know now from good scientific research is that if you challenge your brain on a regular basis, it's going to stay stronger longer than it otherwise would be. And so we recommend to them what we call euphemistically memory rehabilitation services. And we draw an analogy. We say if you broke a bone or you had a heart attack, you'd be in the hospital for a while for acute medical care, but that might not be sufficient to get you completely back to health. And so after your hospitalization has ended, you may need to go to a cardiac rehab center if it was a heart attack, or you might need to go to a physical therapy center if you've had a broken bone and you need physical therapy. Well, the good news we'll say is you haven't had a heart attack and you haven't broken a bone, but your brain has been injured, and now we need to give your brain rehabilitation. And there are two forms of rehabilitation available: outpatient or residential. And here are the pros and cons. And we talk about moving into memory care as if it is a little bit like going back to school, where you're going to be in a place where every day, and this is not distortion, this is accurate. We'll say you're going to be in a place where every day you'll have the opportunity to engage in a whole spectrum of physical and intellectually stimulating activities that will keep your mind and body strong. And that's what we want. We want you to have the healthiest life you can have. We want your brain to be as strong as it can be. And so we recommend some form of memory rehab, and then we get them focused on either the outpatient or inpatient option. Talk about the pros and cons. Lastly, we say very carefully, very on purpose, they'll say, well, how long will I need to be there? And we will say, honestly, I don't know. But as long as you feel that being there is benefiting you, then it probably would make sense to stick it out. What we don't want to say is, for the rest of your life. That's just too big a pill for anyone to swallow. And also, I don't frankly know that that's really the truth, because so many things can happen that would change the course of a person's life. So we say, I don't know, but what I can say is, right now, this is what makes sense. And as your doctor or as your team of clinicians, this is what we're recommending. Now, sometimes we're lucky and it just goes really smoothly. Sometimes it doesn't go so smoothly. And so we have to, in those meetings, be prepared to handle grief. And as we were talking about earlier, keep my box of Kleenex handy, because there inevitably will be tears impacting the older adult who has to make this move, tears in the eyes of the loved ones, the younger adults in the room who really care about this person and are also moved by the difficulty of the situation. But we have to, so much about human behavior, and then I'll stop soon. So much about human behavior is this thing called acting out. And we think that only kids act out. Oh, if that were true. None of us are immune to acting out. And what we mean by acting out is when you have emotions that for whatever reason you haven't had a chance to put them into words. But guess what? Those emotions don't disappear. Those of you who took physics in college may remember the law of thermodynamics, where energy is never lost from the world, it's just transformed from one state to another. Does that ring any bells for anybody? Okay, I see some hands. Well, I think there's a very similar rule that applies to human emotion. Emotions just don't evaporate into thin air. If we don't take the time to put those feelings into words, they're going to find some other way to express themselves. And what we fear most is that they're going to go underground and we're going to lose conscious control over them, and they're going to be the motivator for behaviors that may or may not be adaptive. So when someone is resisting going into residential care, when to everyone else in the room it is as obviously necessary as can be, the roadblocks are the unexpressed emotions. And what we have to recognize is sometimes we have to give that person some time to explore their feelings and express their feelings and go through those stages of grieving until they get to a point where their feelings are no longer causing them to act out through this thing we call resistance, and they're able to actually partner and begin to make really smart and wise choices.
All long-term care policies are going to have basically two factors that come into play. It's either a physical impairment or a cognitive impairment, okay? And in the physical impairment, they measure it by activities of daily living. So they have 6 of them that they look at. And if, depending on the policy and when you bought it, but most of them are 2 out of 6 ADLs, activities of daily living. So if 2 out of those 6 can't be met, and those are things such as bathing, transferring in and out of bed or to a wheelchair, or a scooter, or whatever your mode of transportation is, showering, eating, do you have continence? Basic things like that. And if you can't do 2 out of 6 of those, that policy will trigger and start paying the benefits. Now, depending on the carrier, I always say when you're considering long-term care insurance, there's the 3 C's I want you to remember. And the first C is the carrier, okay? Go with a solid carrier that has priced their product appropriately to pay claims, right? As I mentioned, there's only down to about 10 carriers in the space, okay? If you bought a policy in the last 5 years, you're probably all right. If you have an older policy, there's a strong chance you probably got a letter in the mail in the last couple of years that said, we're sorry, we need to increase your rates. Anybody get one of those letters in the mail? So it's happening. I'm seeing it unfold all the time with these policies. So the carrier is super important. Look at their strength ratings. Are they the highest you can get is a AAA rated carrier rating? I wouldn't really go below an A+ rating. That's probably my floor. B ratings or below means they're probably not in good financial stability, and probably have a lot of liabilities on the books that they can't meet. The next C is the cost. Okay, so we always have to be cognizant of the cost. As we know with anything, cost is not always determinant of the value, right? Sometimes you get what you pay for. So yes, cost is a factor. We need to be aware of budget. What can we afford? We have a lot of priorities to balance, whether it's saving for retirement or kids' college, etc. And so it's hard to kind of find that balance. But then the last one is the contract. So all of these contracts are written by attorneys, no offense, and they're hired by the insurance companies to write these contracts, okay? So the proof is in the pudding in the fine print. And you'll see a lot of these things where they'll say, oh, it's a $200 a day benefit or $6,000 a month. And they'll say it's $6,000 a month, but when you see the contract, it actually is a $200 a day benefit. So they'll cover the $200 and then you're out of pocket for the difference. And in your mind, you were sold by the insurance agent that it's actually a $6,000 a month benefit. No, it's really a $200 a day benefit.
What was that? That average daily amount was $400 and.
In San Diego, it's $408.
So then you're out of pocket $200 a day if it's not covering it.
Correct. Yep. So the 3 C's: the carrier, the cost, and the contract. What's the underlying contract?
Well, and the other thing is sometimes those policies have like 90-day.
Yes,
triggers.
There's an elimination period that you select. When you buy the policy, you have the ability to. The shortest I've seen is a 6-week elimination, which means you're out of pocket for cost of care for those first 6 weeks before that policy triggers. And then I've seen others that offer, most common are 12-week elimination, so basically a 3-month period that those costs will be out of pocket until the policy kicks in. But depending on your assets, depending on your liquidity, depending on all those things, that's where you work with a good advisor to look at all those things to design the policy that's most appropriate. Because if you've got enough liquidity to cover you for a couple of years, well, maybe we don't do an elimination period until 365 days, because we can cover the out-of-pocket with our personal assets, and that'll drive the premium cost of the insurance way down. Okay, so all these policies can be designed to fit the client's needs, and so it's important to work with somebody who knows what they're doing with that.
So I know that what comes to mind for most folks right off the bat is the cost. And so you want to be very open and honest with the people that you're speaking with in these communities and ask them up front, what does that cost look like and what is included in that cost? Because a lot of times there will be ancillary charges to add on, or maybe they give you over the phone, it's $3,000 a month, but then you get there and it's, we're going to add on for showering and dressing and medication management, and our transportation has a cost, and there's a meal plan. You can choose which one makes the most sense. You know, some communities will be all-inclusive, which is a lovely way to go, because then you know that as care needs change, your bill's not going to continue to change with it. So you always want to ask up front, what does this look like? What does the cost look like now? And what is the highest amount that I could possibly pay here? And you want to make sure that you might be comfortable with that cost, because as your needs change, as your care needs change, you might be landing up in that top tier if they're on a tiered level or point system or things like that. And you want to make sure that that's a comfort zone for you. Because the thing is, once you move in, you know, we've talked about how it's a tough thing to move. It's tough emotionally, it's tough physically, it's tough on every part of it. And so you want to make sure that you're not having to do this several times. And if you move into a community and you're now working with a team that you've grown to love and trust, and they know you, they know your care needs, they know everything about you, but all of a sudden, because of an illness or injury that bumped you up into another tier, you're now priced out of the home you love. Now you've got to scramble and find something new. So make sure you look at all the costs involved in that community, and is it something that you're comfortable with? You want to look at, what does their team look like? You know, who's involved with their team? Some of the smaller communities, they may have an LVN who oversees, and then a couple of caregivers. Other communities may have, like I mentioned before, they may have a larger team, like a dietitian and cognitive enrichment directors and nurses and medical directors that are involved. So what does the team look like? What is their training involved? And you might want to ask longevity. What does the team's longevity look like? If you have a high turnover ratio, well, you know, we all know that if you don't have happy staff, you're not going to have happy residents. So look at that too. So they're very important things. When you tour, I always encourage folks to try to schedule a tour and then come back 2 more times and do it unannounced and at various times during the day. I tell my daughter the same thing when she's touring daycares, because anybody can look really good once. You know, if it's a planned visit, of course we're going to shine. We know you're coming, and I'm not trying to badmouth my community, but I'm saying we know you're coming, and we want to show you all the great things that we can do for you. So we're pushing them all right out front. But when you come back to visit, do you see those same things? If we told you we have this great, full, wonderful activity calendar and there's so much to choose from, and there's always something going on, when you come back, is that what you saw? Did you see the caregiver ratio that we discussed? Did you see the team that we originally discussed? Are they still on campus? You want to look at all of those things. And again, I always encourage people to do 1 planned visit that's already scheduled, and then do 2 more that are random drop-ins. You know, I would never put my child in daycare that I didn't do random drop-ins on. So I certainly wouldn't move my mother somewhere when they're in charge of her dressing, grooming, bathing, medication management, ambulation. You know, those are a lot of things to take care of. I need to know you can take care of it. When you walk through the building, you know, what does it look like with the team that's there? Are they smiling? Are they making eye contact with you? Are they engaging with you? Or are they dropping their eyes as they walk past you? Because if they're dropping their eyes as you walk past, I'm going to worry, are they doing that when my mom's walking past them as well? You want to look at the upkeep of the building. Now, there's some beautiful older buildings out there that maybe the decor is dated, but that's really not why you're there. That's more a real estate thing, you know, but why you're there is the care. However, if you walk through and there's things that can easily be remedied, like burnt out light bulbs or no toilet paper stocked up, if they don't have the time to take care of those things, do they have time to take care of my mom? So those are the kinds of things that you want to look for, and the questions that you want to ask. And of course, all of us are going to be available. You have all of our contact information if you think of anything else. Now, I would love to welcome everybody home to Monarch Cottage La Jolla, but I know that we're not the right fit for everybody, and maybe not everybody's looking for a community setting. So I always want to be available as a resource. If somebody has questions, they have concerns, they need help connecting with resources, because that's why most of us got into this industry, because we care and we want to make a difference and we want to find the right fit for you. Even if it's not with me, I'll take that, that's fine. But we want to make sure you find the right fit.